Okay, we are live on YouTube. Anybody who is on the live stream, we will be getting started in a couple of minutes. And we will, Elena, you're in. This is my colleague, Elena Gaona, who is going to be helping with the tech and with the chat. As I told you, you do not need to worry about the chat at all. Just leave it alone. That you will be able to look at the questions and answer box, but I will be responding and kind of like moderating that section. So don't worry about it either. Just you can just present and relax. Okay. I have 7:58. Any other questions before we get started? Christine, do you prefer to go by your full name or just Christine Hinsey? You're muted.
It's probably just easier to say Christine Hinsey.
Okay.
Thank you.
Elena, do you have a question?
Oh, I was just wondering, should we start live streaming as you have?
It's live streaming already.
Oh, hi, everyone. I'm going back off camera now.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and hit start. So we will be going live on Zoom. Oops. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm going to get started in a few seconds, really waiting for more folks to start entering this webinar, but welcome. Okay, we're going to get started with some of the preliminary things. My name is Paz Artaza Regan, and I am Program Manager at Catholic Climate Covenant. I want to welcome all of those of you attending, and especially our panelists tonight. This is a special message for our Spanish language attendees. So I'm now going to go into Spanish. Give me a little moment here. Les doy la bienvenida a todos los participantes que hablan español. Esta información es para ustedes. Si está participando en este evento a través de la transmisión en vivo en YouTube, no tendrá acceso a la interpretación simultánea en español. La interpretación solo funciona si está participando a través de Zoom. Incluiremos la grabación de la interpretación en español con el correo electrónico que mandaremos en los próximos días. Para escuchar la interpretación, vean los controles abajo y busque donde está el globo. Allí va a hacer clic donde dice Interpretation, interpretación. Haga después clic en el idioma que le gustaría escuchar. En su caso, español, Spanish. Esto es opcional porque para escuchar el idioma interpretado, haga clic en Mute Original, silenciar el audio original. Debe unirse el audio de la reunión a través del audio de la computadora, no a través del teléfono. Si está a través del teléfono, no tendrá interpretación. Esta sesión, I gotta do it in English now. The session is being recorded, and a link to the recorded will be sent to everyone who is registered within the next 24 to 48 hours. If you're on the Zoom platform, please type your questions in the Q&A box. If you're watching on the live stream on the YouTube channel, you will need to email your questions to info@catholicclimatecovenant.org. If you know which panelist the question is directed to, please add that information to your question. The chat is available for you to chat with others who are attending the session. You should not submit questions in the chat. We do request that everyone stay respectful within the chat, and also please note that you will not be able to save the chat. At this time, we're going to get started with an opening prayer. If you would center yourselves, quiet yourselves, and remember that we are always in God's holy presence. Walk lightly. Each leaf, each petal, each grain, each person sings your praises, Creator God. Each creature on the earth, all the mountains and great seas show your glory, Spirit of love. And yet the hand of greed has patented and plundered your splendor, has taken and not shared your gift, has lived as owner of the earth, not guest. And so the ice is cracked, the rivers dry, the valleys flooded, and the snow caps melt. God, our Creator, show us how to step gently, how to live simply, how to walk lightly with respect and love for all that you have made. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. This Laudato Si in the U.S. Catholic Church is the biennial conference series that has been co-sponsored by Creighton University and Catholic Climate Covenant to equip and inspire Catholics to more deeply integrate Laudato Si and its creation care teachings into the U.S. Catholic Church. In this last of the three-part series, we will focus on the 7 goals of the Laudato Si action platform to encourage a greater understanding of the platform's 7 goals: response to the cry of the poor, ecological economics, this session on adoption of sustainable lifestyle, ecological education, ecological spirituality, community resilience and empowerment, and response to the cry of the earth, and encourage Catholic individuals and groups to enroll in the platform with a clear path to accomplishing each of the goals. Catholic Climate Covenant is coordinating the Laudato Si action platform in the U.S. Catholic Church through its God's Planet initiative, and Creighton University is a platform signatory. Today, we're going to focus on goal number 3 of the Laudato Si action platform, adoption of sustainable lifestyles. In chapter 6 of Laudato Si, Pope Francis centers the discussion of sustainable lifestyles within the current dynamic of compulsive consumerism that is engendered by the feelings of instability and uncertainty, which in turn he believes become a seabed for collective selfishness. This is a quote from Laudato Si. When people become self-centered and self-enclosed, their greed increases. The emptier a person's heart is, the more he or she needs things to buy, own, or consume. It becomes almost impossible to accept the limits imposed by reality. In this horizon, a genuine sense of the common good also disappears. And today, in a word, the issue of environmental degradation, challenges us to examine our lifestyle. In September 2021, in his monthly prayer intentions, Pope Francis reiterated the human roots of the ecological crisis and invited us to consider the ways we use material goods of creation and to reflect on how the ways that we eat, the ways that we consume, travel, the ways we use water, energy, plastic, and many other material goods is often harmful to the earth. So he asks us to let us choose change. Let us advance with young people, especially towards lifestyles that are simpler and more respectful of the environment. Let us pray, he says, that we all make courageous choices necessary for a simple and environmentally sustainable lifestyle, taking inspiration from our young people who are resolutely committed to this. And they aren't foolish because they are committed to their own future. This is why they want to change what they will inherit at a time when we no longer will be here. And that gets us to the beginning of our panel. Joining me today to unpack the issues of the platform goal of sustainable lifestyles are Dr. Christine Hinze, who is professor and chair of the Department of Theology and emeritus director of the Francis Ann Curran Center for American Catholic Studies at Fordham University. And I will do a longer bios for each of you as I present you later. Dr. Juliet Shore, professor of sociology at Boston College, and Shana Fagan, OSF, Order of Secular Franciscans, senior academic technology consultant at Bates College. And to get us started, it will be Dr. Hinze. So let me stop share so that you may go ahead and share your PowerPoint, and you have the floor, Dr. Hinze. You're muted, Dr. Hinze. Still muted.
Everyone, let's
There
try.
you are.
Okay, let's try it again. Oops. Hold on. I just want to make sure I can move these. Let's try this. There we go. All right. Hoping everyone can see this. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here tonight. As we all know, this is such a huge issue and such an important issue. And yet, even though it's all around us, it's difficult to find the time to really focus on it and do so in a positive way. And one of the things I love about the Laudato Si action platform and what Pope Francis has given us in Laudato Si is I find it to be an avenue that gives hope because it focuses on the reality, but also on our own agency to make a difference. Tonight, we're talking about one of the 7 values or key elements of this platform, the adoption of sustainable lifestyles. But as Paz mentioned, there are 7 of these goals. These are a little blurry, but I think it's important to remember that all 7 goals are connected and interdependent. So to speak about simple lifestyle brings in spirituality, economics, and so forth. And also, and this is what I was asked to speak about tonight, all 7 are confirmed by and grounded in our Catholic Christian faith and our social traditions. Not that these aren't available to everyone of goodwill, but in fact, they do reflect deep things about our tradition. So when Pope Francis is speaking, as this quote says, that destroying the environment is a grave sin, and when he says that we cannot save the environment without also addressing the profound injustices in the distribution of the goods of the earth, he is restating ancient biblical teaching. So these are the roots that he is building on when he makes these very contemporary statements. And I want to set this up by saying, in order to understand what we're talking about by living sustainably, I believe we need to start with this notion of the economy in a very broad sense. In Greek, the meaning of economy translates to oikonomia, which in the root meaning is care for the household. And our Catholic social tradition emphasizes this broader, really classical meaning and understanding of economy. The purpose of an economy is to provide for the members, inclusive provisioning. So our tradition regards economy and ecology in light of God's oikonomia. God has the biggest household, we might say, the biggest economy. And our tradition tells us that God intends creation for the sustenance and well-being of all. Everyone should have enough. Isn't that a beautiful word, enough? Just looking at it makes me feel good. When we think of the earth, our tradition tells us, especially our modern Catholic social tradition, that the earth itself is a common good, a shared good, given for the sustenance of and enjoyment of you and I, but also all peoples and all creatures. So there's a way of looking at reality here that comes through. It's a very interconnected, relational way of seeing ourselves in relation to communities, to cultures, to ultimately to the earth as well. So in and through multiple interdependent communities, humans participate in the common good of the earth's oikonomia. The largest common good in Christian theology and Christian belief is God. God is the good that encompasses all the other goods. And so the earth encompasses us in our planet, our nations and our cultures encompass us. Then we have our local communities, our families, our households, and so forth. And it's important for Catholic thought that all of these be vital and all of these be flourishing. So it's a very multivariant, very relational way of looking at reality and of the economy in particular and our place in it, as well as ecology. So political economies on this view serve the common good. That's why they're there, by providing sustainable, ample sufficiency, or they should be doing this, enough for everyone. Now, you've already figured out that this Catholic way of seeing things and this classical way of seeing economics and economy is very, very countercultural to what our modern dominant economic and consumerist cultures teach us. The two figures there, one of the big messages we're told when we enter into the economic world and we start thinking about our economic lifestyle is you're on your own. You better make sure you take care of yourself. That's key to our sort of individualist, capitalist market way of looking. The other part that comes through our consumer culture, which was already referenced by Pope Francis at the beginning, is that in this culture, you never really have enough because there's always more that you're going to want. And so, let me get to the next slide. So in our mass consumer culture, we are taught to seek not sufficiency, not enough, but what's more, what's newer, what's better. And this culture, and by the way, this culture isn't educating us. It forms us. It forms our seeing, acting, and thinking and feeling. And I suspect some of our other panelists will speak about this further. And this way of living in the world and seeing the world foments what the Pope calls a throwaway culture. And most importantly, it reduces the idea of enough to something that's ever receding and really unattainable. In a certain way, in our consumer culture where the standard of living is always to increase, and I'm not saying any of this is bad in say, okay, but this is what kind of the air we breathe. We are taught on a visceral level that we will never get to enough. So after I have enough income, I will be able to give to others. After I have enough saved, I will be able to retire. But our culture tells us, maybe you don't have enough. And there's always something more. There's always the next phone, etc. Okay, why isn't that working? Oh, shoot. So in a nutshell, there is just a very big difference between the way this dominant marketist and what we might call a Laudato Si economic vision look at the world and look at people. So I have it very here in bullet points, right? Our dominant viewpoint is atomized homo economicus. You know, those of you who've taken economics 101, it's the individual maximizer of preferences, right? Whereas in this view, the focus is on embodied, interrelated, we might call it homo solidaritas, this very relational understanding of the human being. On the one hand, competition for individual gain. On the other, collaboration for inclusive provisioning, efficiency, profit, and growth versus sufficiency and sustainability. Creation is an object to use. Creation is a gift to be shared. Desires are oriented toward more and better and newer. And by the way, this also affects our own self-image. If I can't get more, if I can't do more, if I can't be better, if I'm not up to date, I am less valuable. And on the other hand, desires for enough, for flourishing, and so forth. Markets well-being versus the well-being of vulnerable peoples and planet, and individual wealth and property and the common good of all people. So notice on the left-hand side how we are all on our own striving. We do wonderful things that way, but it's different than the framework we see on the right. It's not that one cancels out the other. If we go to the right side of the screen, it's not like we forget all those things on the left. It's what do we prioritize? What is most important? So if we're going to adopt sustainable lifestyles, which is the topic for tonight, to authentically embrace I put the LS7, those 7 different goals, we're going to need to cultivate countercultural habits, different ways. And I would say we need to work on a different culture among, not just with ourselves, but with our families and our communities and so forth, that I summarize as solidarity and sufficiency. The linkages we have among each other and the earth and our responsibilities, that's solidarity. And sufficiency, being able to understand what enough is and live in a way that's very wholesome, but also is not one of excess and always wanting more and more and more. And we need, if those are going to work, we need to anchor them in a deep spiritual grounding. Okay, but the question is how, right? You and I know that in our daily lives, we kind of succumb to the status quo culture, at least I do most of the time. And even though I have good intentions, doing anything different from what I've always done is very difficult. So what sparks or enlivens or sustains the difficult commitments to living with sufficiency and solidarity that we and our vulnerable neighbors so badly need today, as well as the planet? And I'm going to suggest, again, this is just such a brief time, but I want to suggest one key element of religious traditions that is applicable here, way beyond religion. And this is what is the term conversion. And this is something Pope Francis speaks of in Laudato Si. He says, we need to have engage in an ecological conversion, by which he means a deep and fundamental change of orientation, the way we see, the way we feel, the way we're disposed to act, a different way that changes our way of relating with ourselves, with our vulnerable neighbors, and with creation. And he gets this term actually from John Paul II, who was the first to use this in Catholic teaching. This notion of conversion, and here I'm quoting a famous Jesuit theologian, is, which he calls it's a shift in your fundamental orientation, an about face, important, from self-enclosure, it's all about me, to self-transcendence, I see things in a larger way. I see myself connected and responsible beyond myself. This is a process, not an event. And it's an ongoing, bumpy, uneven process that really lasts a lifetime. When we think of conversion, sometimes we think of, Paul getting knocked off his horse and completely changing his life and then going and preaching the gospel. Okay, there are a few people that have those kinds of conversions, but changing into the better person community, that's a long haul process. So an image I really like for this is the idea that conversion entails a kind of unclenching of our minds, our hearts, our spirits that enables us to enter into truer, deeper relationships with ourselves, with our neighbors, with the world, and God. So this idea of the fist versus the open hand, we're taught a lot in our economic lives, especially, is to take care of ourselves, make sure you're protected. Don't just give away what you have, be in control and so forth. And what the gospel calls us to, and I think the ecological crisis, is a shift that entails opening up our hands and our hearts in a new way. And this is the essence of a posture receptive to conversion. Notice that some theologians liken conversion to falling and being in love. So an ecological conversion has a deep affect dimension too, and this comes across in Laudato Si. People who are converted to ecological responsibility most often also have kind of fallen in love with the reality of their relationship to nature and the world. And this is really important because that's what creates the eros, creates the energy for the difficult work ahead. And of course, our faith and our gospels invite us into this journey of unclenching, of opening up to and coming to rely on a different kind of sufficiency, a different kind of security and status than what you get in the economy or by your standard of living or by keeping up with the latest trends. The one offered by God's economy or household, and this is the woman, the poor woman giving her last 2 cents and being quite judged by her peers for doing so, but she's working according to a different economy than most of us do. To go further, ecological conversion means cultivating ways of seeing, judging, and acting that are no longer, or at least less, ruled by our yo-yo, in other words, you're on your own, and never enough fears and insecurities. And our contemporary consumer market culture really relies on us being ruled by those fears and insecurities. That's what keeps us buying. That's what keeps us feeling insufficient, even though we have more than enough. Notice the contrast with, for example, Psalm 23. I will dwell in the household of the Lord all the days of my life. I shall not want. He will spread a banquet for me, et cetera, et cetera. It's a beautiful rendition of God's economy and as a grounding spirituality that I think is absolutely needed, so hard, but absolutely needed for dedicating ourselves to these changes. So a posture of conversion opens us up to not just being more, sufficient and less greedy, but it opens up to this deeper spirituality of wonder, humility, and even peace that Francis tells us, and this is in chapter 6, which was referenced of Laudato Si, that's critical to pursuing solidarity and sustainable lives and institutions. He says, Christian spirituality encourages a prophetic and contemplative lifestyle capable of deep enjoyment, free of the obsession with consumption, a return to that simplicity which allows us to stop and appreciate the small things, to be grateful for the opportunities that life affords us. And he sees this among the poor, more so than among the rich oftentimes. Inner peace is closely related to care for ecology and the common good because when we live it out, it's reflected in a balanced lifestyle together with a capacity for wonder. Isn't that important? That's so interesting, which takes us to a deeper understanding of life. So there's something about the beautiful, about falling in love, about the affective that's so important here. Now, changing and becoming, starting to ride the bike and giving up the air conditioning or whatever it's going to be specifically, and becoming more solidary, sufficient, and sustainable, that's not easy. This is one of my favorite comics. I think it really says something about our human nature. Who wants change? Everybody. Who wants to change? Well, I'm not so sure. At least it says a lot about how I tend to react. However, and this is the important emphasis of Laudato Si', the problems are huge. The path toward addressing these structural issues is solidarity and sufficiency, but it's a path best, this is something Francis says, it's a path best taken together. You can't do it alone. You have agency, but you need community, you need others, you need like-minded people to support and challenge and move us forward. And you can start wherever you are, the Pope tells us in Laudato Si'. Everyone can do something. Together, those somethings begin to build a different culture that becomes then the basis for the different kind of world that we need in order to love the earth and the poor and all of God's people and creatures. Thank you.
Thank you. And I apologize. I went right to you and I skipped presenting you with your full presentation. I put it in the chat.
Good.
But I do want to make sure that folks know a little bit more about you. I want them to know that you teach foundational and applied issues in Christian social ethics, Catholic social thought, and economic and work justice for vulnerable women, families, and groups. You're the author of a book called Radical Sufficiency, Work, Livelihood, and the U.S. Catholic Economic Ethic, and one that's close to my heart, Glass Ceilings, Dirt Floors, Women, Work, and the Global Economy. And I want also for folks to understand that you served as president of the Catholic Theological Society of America, and you've presided over the Society's 2022 approved resolution to divest its endowment from fossil fuels. And I thank you for that.
Thank you.
I didn't want to leave you without that first. We will go to each panelist, and then at the end, we'll do some Q&A and also a little conversation among the panelists. Next is Dr. Juliet B. Schor, professor of sociology at Boston College. And Juliet, you may want to get on camera while I introduce you. Juliet's teaching and research focuses on work, consumption, and climate change. Are you having trouble getting on camera, Julia?
Yeah, it's someone disabled it. So
okay, let me make sure I can. There, does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I wanted you to be on camera as I gave your bio. You received a PhD in economics at the University of Massachusetts, then went to Boston College and taught at Harvard University. No, before going to Boston College, you taught at Harvard University for 17 years in the Department of Economics. And I was totally blown away by the books that you have published. She has a bestseller, The Overworked American, The Unexpected Decline of Leisure. I think all of us probably can read that and go, oh yes. The Overspent American, Why We Want What We Don't Need, and True Wealth, How and Why Millions of Americans Are Creating a Time-Rich, Ecologically Light, Small-Scale, High Satisfaction Economy. You were the recipient of the 2011 Herman Daly Award from the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics, and you've served as consultant to the United Nations, the World Institute for Development Economics Research, and the United Nations Development Program. And we asked you today to come explain the sociology of throwaway culture and sustainability simplicity. What does it mean? And also, how did we get here? Here being the throwaway culture that is so evident all the ways around us. And I'm talking too fast, I apologize. And practical ways to move towards adoption of sustainable lifestyles. And I will also put your bio in the chat.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And it's a privilege to go after Dr. Christine Hinze. We have shared stages before, but it's such a, I think, such a really good basis for what I want to talk about. And I think probably all three of us are very much in sync on a number of things. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to talk today sort of about some of the big picture issues associated with sustainable lifestyles. And hold on, I just need to move these around. Are you seeing the right, are you seeing all the slides or just the slideshow?
The slide shows good. Yes.
We're good. Okay, great. So let me just start with a couple of very quick points, which is, I think everyone on the call knows that if you've read Laudato Si, you know that we are in a period of urgency and we are destabilizing our climate and we are destroying our planetary ecosystems. Just to bring us up to date with the last IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of the UN report of what we need to do. The first point is that contrary to what we had hoped a couple of years ago, we have not yet bent the emissions curve of greenhouse gas emissions or carbon emissions. Here we have global carbon emissions, continuing to rise after this small dip from the COVID period, lockdown period. And the IPCC tells us we need to make rapid, deep, and immediate greenhouse gas emissions reductions. We need to get to, probably net zero by 2050, of course, and close to 50% reduction by 2030. So very urgent reductions. So what about consumption? How does it fit into this climate challenge? How can we live the kind of lifestyle, simple lifestyle, living lightly on the earth that we've been talking about? And I want to start by saying something about what I call the paradox of American affluence, which is that consumption is both the goal of production and a weak read for change. So we need to address consumption, yes, but we can't think that changing consumption is the thing that can transform the whole society and economy. And I'll say a little bit more about that. So let's just get into a couple of sort of basic statistics about consumption and carbon emissions. And here I have a fairly high average household footprint. This is 48 tons of CO2 equivalents. That means all of greenhouse gas emissions translated into an amount of CO2, but it includes, we're accounting for everything, not just, for the methane and the nitrous oxide and so forth. So the first point is the big three: transportation, including travel. That's the first one here. Housing, and with housing, you can see gas, electricity, indirect energy, waste, and food. Those are the big three. Those are the things to focus on. And another way of thinking about this is what's called the 60-15 rule of carbon footprints, which is that 15% of spending leads to 62% of emissions. So it's the electricity, the natural gas, the gasoline, flying, which I'm sure you're all aware of, food, products and services, which is often what people focus on, make up a much smaller fraction than these other big three. So 15% of spending gets us to the 60% of the impact, 62% of the impact. So focus on those things. Now, I'm sorry. Yeah. So One Planet Living involves a 4-ton per person footprint. That is, if everyone in on the planet has the an equivalent, gets their share of ecological space with respect to climate. So how do we get down to that fair 4-ton footprint? Of course, we have to address the big three that I just talked about, but also there are things in the economy that we need to do, inequalities that we need to address. The first point I want to make is that carbon footprints are highly, highly unequal by income level. And you can see here, I mean, it's a common sense thing. People with less than a $5,000 income have about a 20 tons equivalent. And look at the 150,000 or more, they're over 80 tons, when we need to be thinking about that 4-ton. I mean, that's a really big reduction. So going to come back to that theme, but inequality, really key. Number two, we have some heavy meat eaters. 20% of diets account for 45% of greenhouse gas emissions. So we also have a lot of inequality in the way people eat. Some big meat eaters, and then others who have less meat and dairy in their diets. One thing I've learned from studying consumption, and this point comes from one of my graduate students who studied eco-conscious mothers, and she finds that they have a very heavy focus on very time-consuming, but small impact, although symbolic, sustainable behaviors. They're obsessing about plastic and diapers, and they're spending so much time on that they don't have time to do things which are much bigger impact and much more important. And in particular, they don't have time for political activism and activism in their communities, which actually could make a lot more impact. So let me, I already talked about the disproportionality. Let me show you one more graph, which I love. These are ventiles of global population by income, meaning dividing the global population into 20ths. And this looks at the share of growth in total carbon emissions attributable to those breakdowns of the global population. And you can see that the richest two groups, that's the top 10%, so each of these is 5%, are responsible for over 50% of all the growth in carbon emissions. And you can look here and see the long tail of this brontosaurus. And this is the large majority of the global population, which is contributing almost nothing to carbon emissions. We need to avoid what I call the pogo problem, which is we have met the enemy and he is us. So an excessive focus on our own impacts. 100 companies are responsible for more than 70% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the world. There's huge disproportionality. I showed you household disproportionality. It's also true at the company level. It's true at the country level. Pretty much everywhere we look, a small minority is responsible for the vast majority. So we need to focus on that. We need to make big social changes that will really address the power of those highly disproportionate polluters. Of course, it doesn't mean we're off the hook. We're here to talk about sustainable lifestyles, living lightly, and what we can do. And doing something in our own lives is important, but it's also important to keep that bigger picture. So I want to talk about two things that I've been working on, which are really key to transforming the economy in ways that affect consumption in big ways, but that are not just simply about consumption. And the first has to do with working hours. So this is the first graph I ever did. This is the ecological footprint, which includes carbon footprint and even more. It's just a simple 2x2 plot. But what it shows is that countries with higher hours of work have higher carbon emissions, actually, or ecological footprints. And let's look at our own country. So this is a graph of lots of different countries' hours worked from 1973 to 2019. This dotted line is the United States. We have barely decreased our working hours here. In contrast to many other wealthy countries like ourselves who are trading off productivity growth for shorter hours of work. And in the process, what's happening is they have much more success in reducing their ecological impact and their carbon emissions. I wrote that book, The Overworked American, which was just mentioned, and there are other measures. These are by what the companies are reporting. And if you look at what households are reporting, their working hours have actually gone up quite a bit. That makes us a little bit like China and India here, two high hours countries with increasing hours of work, which are, and also high polluting. And big increases in their emissions. And here's one more I just can't resist. When I wrote The Overworked American, which was right about here, Japan was a really high hours country. It's this blue. Look at where they've gone. They're actually below the United States now. So very interesting. This is a graph. I'm happy to share my slides, but this is a graph which looks at how much of different countries' productivity growth have they taken in the form of shorter hours. And you can see here that other than China and India, over this period, the US has taken the smallest amount of productivity growth in the form of shorter hours. And this is that, what I've called work and spend culture that Dr. Hinze was just talking about, which is that materialist culture, there's never enough, the yo-yo, etc. In contrast, the countries that are having real successes in lessening their footprints are Germany, the Netherlands, France, Denmark. I don't think I have them on here, but these countries which have had big declines in working hours and in their carbon emissions. I've called this the work and spend cycle, and I think it's really important to understand that for many people, high spending is linked to long hours of work and high earning. And sort of reducing hours of work is one of the most important ways that we find people are able to reduce their consumption. So when Dr. Hinze asks, how can we do this? I would say, number one thing, reduce hours of work. That's going to set us on a path of much more moderate and sustainable levels of consumption. It's very hard if people earn high incomes or earn more income for them to not to spend it. There's a really strong pressures in our economy. The more you earn, the more you spend. Okay. And I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong screen here. So what I've been doing recently, and I don't have much time to talk about it, but I just want to mention it, is I am researching companies all around the world that are giving their employees a 4-day week, 32 hours, not a compressed work week, but a 32-hour week, which is giving people much more time to do all those kinds of things that Dr. Hinze was talking about, more time to be with their families, more time for their communities. They have more time to do pro-environmental behaviors like recycling and walking or cycling, buying more ecologically sustainable products. One of the things that my research suggests is that when households have more time, they tend to buy much more ecologically sustainable. They tend to purchase and consume in more ecologically sustainable ways. The more time stressed you are, other things being equal, the more likely you are to have a high carbon footprint. These trials of companies have been extremely successful. They have people are less stressed and burned out. They have less anxiety, better mental and physical health. They have higher life and job and time satisfaction. They sleep better, they exercise more, they're less fatigued. They're much more able to live that kind of authentic life that Laudato Si is talking about, because the long hours culture in our country is the twin. It's the opposite side of the high consumption culture. So I'll just end with a couple more points. One is my colleagues and students and I have done a number of papers showing that the more unequal a society is, also the more carbon, the higher the carbon footprint of the society. So what I call powering down, sort of working less, living a more simple life, as well as getting active to address the extreme inequality, which has now become so pervasive in our country, and is not just bad for all the reasons that I think many of us understand, but is itself directly correlated with high carbon emissions. I said earlier that countries with lower working hours have lower carbon emissions, and it's also the case that countries that are more equal have lower carbon emissions. And when those two things get together, high inequality and high working hours, it turns out that's even sort of a supercharges emissions. So it's really important. We have heard already about the pitfalls of materialism, whether it's the stress and tiredness and burnout of the long working hours and burnout culture, the hedonic treadmill of always wanting the next thing, loving it at first, getting used to it, and then needing the next thing, the materialism trap, thinking that more stuff will make you happier, and of course the ecological overshoot associated with materialism. So I'm going to end by saying that changing your own lifestyle is really important. I've done research showing that people who have more sustainable consumption also tend to be more activist in their orientation. And for me, this is a really key connection between how we consume and the larger impact that we have on the earth. The Pope Francis has asked us not just to care about our own personal footprints, but to be active in the world and to make change in the world. And the biggest thing that you can do is to engage in social activism, because without a climate movement and an extinction movement and an ecological movement, without the movement of Laudato Si, people like yourselves coming together to change our communities, our institutions, and all the way up to our federal government here in this second slide or second picture. The government will not move without pressure from people, and we cannot solve these problems without government action. Yes, personal footprint's important, but equally, if not more important, is the ways in which we all engage at every level, including at the movement level, to make change. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. And I love how you incorporated that call for the action and systemic change, that we can't just depend on our own individual actions. We have to come in as a community and work together to change things. Our next speaker is Shauna Fagan, who is a trained educator and currently works as a senior academic technology consultant at Bates College. She holds a Master of Science degree in education as well as instructional technology. She has a bachelor's degree from Yale University, where she majored in political science and studied the origins and impacts of political violence and genocide. She is Mohawk citizen of 6 Nations of the Grand River. She is on the board of the St. Kateri Conservation Center and is a professed member of the Secular Franciscan Order. Shauna also writes about the intersection of Indigenous issues and Catholicism at Fiat Sanctum. Shauna will highlight Indigenous perspectives on sustainability and simplicity. What can we learn from Indigenous communities about sustainability simplicity? And we're asked her to speak about that because both Pope Francis and the Global South bishops especially have really lifted the idea that the voice of the Indigenous communities needs to be heard. That we need to, as Catholics, hear our brothers and sisters from Indigenous communities, what they have to teach us about living wisely, living sustainably, and living in partnership with all of creation. So Shauna, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Paz, and it's a real honor to speak after my two co-panelists. They have such impressive resumes. I'm quite overcome. So let me go ahead and share my slides with you. So I was asked to speak here today from the perspective of an Indigenous person, and listening to the two panelists that have spoken so far, I had the sense that what I'm giving you today is some items that could help work towards what Dr. Hinza brought up about the ecological conversion that Pope Francis wants us to overcome. And so from looking at things from the Indigenous perspective, I don't have a lot of firm action items. Here's what you should be doing. And you should, those certainly, I have some of those to look at, but a lot of it is more about how can we change our perspective? How can we change our mindset about our relationship with the earth? And then how can that eventually lead to some sustainable changes down the road? So before we get too far deep, I wanted to give you a very brief sense for who I am as an Indigenous person and how that impacts what I'm presenting to you here today. And it also sort of serves as a neat little snapshot of, if you're not as familiar with Indigenous people, of how they can sort of how it works with the land and where people have come from and where they may be distributed this day and age, and looking at ancestral homelands versus where people are now. So I thought this could kind of help set the stage for the conversations a little bit. And this is my nation. So this is the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. You may know them as the Iroquois Confederacy. That's another way that they are referred to by. And the Haudenosaunee are a confederation of 6 nations. So we have the Tuscarora, the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, and the Mohawk. And all 6 of these nations work together, but yet still have their own individual languages and cultures and traditions and land. And we are all very closely related in one way or another, but do still maintain our own sovereign lands and governance. And what might be interesting to you is that I'm Mohawk, and I'm actually from the same tribe as Saint Gedele de Gakwita. I pronounce her name with the Mohawk pronunciation. So I have both her and me on this map, if I can be so bold. So you can see here, so Gedele grew up, I'm trying to find my own mouse here, it's running away from me. But Gedele grew up in the Albany area, if you look north of Albany on the map, near modern day Fonda, New York. And those are the ancestral homelands of the Mohawk people. And then after the Revolutionary War, the Mohawks were forcibly removed to a number of different areas. And prior to that, Gedele herself voluntarily left her community and went north to, if you see the arrow up at the top there, a Mohawk community called Ganawage that's just outside of Montreal. And that's where she chose to live out the rest of her life so that she could really kind of fully live her Catholicism. Now, I was born in Niagara Falls, New York, so just north of the Tuscarora Nation on this map here, right on the border with Canada. And my community where I come from is 6 nations of the Grand River. So they are over the border in Canada. So my family is from 6 nations, but from the time of my grandfather onward, they moved off reserve and lived in the United States. So this kind of gives you a sense for how you might have land that you originally came from, but then for one reason or another, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, people have moved. And that can, but yet you still maintain your sense of community with the people where you came from. So who are Indigenous people and why should we listen to them? Why should their voices be included in this conversation? So I pulled this definition of sorts, and I wouldn't say it's truly a definition, from the United Nations. So they have a permanent forum on Indigenous issues, and they pulled together some factors that contribute to what makes up an Indigenous peoples, a group of Indigenous peoples. And this is a definition that is ever changing and evolving, and it is very much not agreed upon by all people. But these are some factors that are generally common across all Indigenous people. And some for our purposes, things that I think are important to point out would be that you self-identify as an Indigenous person at the individual level, but yet you are also accepted and claimed by your community. And that can be either through, membership or citizenship with your nation, where you're sort of official, so to speak, or if you are descended from that nation, but aren't able to pass their citizenship requirements, but yet you're still accepted by your community. So that's an important piece here. So when I talk about Indigenous peoples, it's not just, oh, well, I heard that my great grandmother was Indigenous. And so do I sort of have some of this sort of magic that Indigenous peoples have when it comes to, ecological issues. And that's different from what we're talking about here. And we'll also be going into why it's very much not magic, why it has a strong connection to the land. So the strong link to territories and surrounding natural resources, a resolve to maintain and reproduce their ancestral environments and systems. So all of these things, these distinct social, economic, and political systems are really what kind of form the foundation of what an Indigenous person is. So what can we learn from Indigenous people? There's a lot that we can learn. For our purposes today, I wanted to highlight 3 things that I thought would be most important. And that is what is referred to as an ethics of place, in stewardship of the environment, and then a spirituality of Thanksgiving. And one thing that's important to note is that Indigenous people are very much not a monolith. There are hundreds of nations, 500 plus alone just in the United States. And they are all different, and they all have their own traditions and cultural points. And so there are going to be some points of overlap, but then everybody ultimately lives in alignment with their own distinct set of values. So I pulled this quote from Rebecca Sosi, who's a law professor from the Yaqui Nation, that I thought was really spoke to me, which is that Indigenous peoples have survived as separate and distinct nations within often challenging natural, political, and economic environments, precisely because they maintain cultural values consistent with sustainability. So sustainability really being at the center of what it means to be an Indigenous person, and that it's not something that, we have learned that we should do, or we heard the Pope should tell us that we should do, but more, this is the way that we've always been. This is the way that generations upon generations have learned to live with the land in a way that would help guarantee their sustainability as a people and the land around them going forward. So this idea of an ethics of place is looking at, looking at political things, looking at the spiritual side, looking at society and how a culture lives within a place. All of these are all inherently parts of being in a place. So a place is not merely a house that you buy, or a yard that you walk across, or a place that you go to work. Place is so much more than that. It's a complicated issue and a really beautiful one. And it's one that I think as humans, we've become a bit detached from what it means to be in a place. So the other thing that Indigenous peoples do is they take a very hyperlocal approach to their land. So hyperlocal meaning, in many cases, Indigenous peoples have lived in an area for a countless number of generations, particularly if they haven't been forcibly removed, like you might see in the tribes that are out west. And because of that, they know that land so well, because it's been told to them, the oral histories that have been passed down about how that land has functioned, about what has happened there. They work together in community and really get to know where they live and what works well for that land, when it needs a break, when you can, lean in a little bit and, plant some new crops, et cetera. And so that hyperlocal approach is what leads to that really deep well of Indigenous knowledge that we can get from Indigenous peoples. So, for example, Indigenous groups will trend towards regenerative approaches with regards to the food system. So that those can include things like periodically not fishing in a certain area so that the fish populations can regrow and not become overfished, as well as replenishing soil so that plants that are native to that area can repopulate and grow and produce food without humans even really needing to interfere and try to produce food from that area. The food just generates on its own. Okay, so this like really deep knowledge, this intimate knowledge and connection with land is really at the heart of Indigenous nations. So I wanted to look at stewardship next because I felt the theme of stewardship throughout Laudato Si. So stewardship meaning you are caring for land, you are not owning land, you are not dominating land, you are not saying, oh, this is mine, I can take it. You're really working in harmony, in communion with the land together in this symbiotic relationship. So for my people, for the Haudenosaunee, law, society, and nature are equal partners in governance and in culture, and each one plays an important role. And a big component of that is something which is called the seventh generation principle. And seventh generation referring to 7 generations down the road. What decisions am I going to make now that are going to impact my children's children, et cetera? So a quote from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy's official Grand Council's website is that we borrow the earth from our children's children, and it is our duty to protect it and the culture for future generations. All decisions made now are made with the future generations who will inhabit the earth in mind. And to me, this just seems right in line with what Pope Francis is trying to teach us about how we need to start thinking about our decisions when it comes to the environment and to what our lifestyle is going to be like in concert with the environment. So notably, this statistic I always find quite stunning, Native people, so there's Indigenous peoples all over the world. So Native people make up only 5% of the world's total population, and yet they steward and protect 80% of its biodiversity. So Indigenous rights and Indigenous issues are not just Indigenous problems. They are all of us. They involve all of us, because if you lose Indigenous people, if they are forced away from their land or their populations dwindle or anything like that, they lose access to water reserves that they used to protect and whatnot. It has a huge impact on the total biodiversity in the world. The last thing that we can learn from Indigenous peoples is they're looking at their spirituality of Thanksgiving. Now, every Native nation is going to have a different way of living out their spirituality. And in fact, there are many Indigenous Catholics. So these aren't all people like myself. So these aren't all people that are living in the traditional spiritualities, although there are many, many of those. But a lot of those traditional spiritualities include really focusing on Thanksgiving for the earth, for what the earth gives us, for the creator that made the earth and has given it to us to support us. And I loved this little graphic I pulled from an article about the global food system and Indigenous knowledge, which is that spirituality is important and the basis for every part of the food system to Indigenous peoples, and that humans are seen as stewards of their environment. Contrast that with the typical industrial model, which is that, in a sense, capital and profit have become the spirituality. Those are what's put at the forefront, and that they are extracting resources in order to make money. Now, certainly we are seeing a change where there's greater pressure being put on corporations to make better decisions when it comes to these things, but ultimately the capital and the profit are there and really pushing those companies along. One of the things that the Haudenosaunee do is they have something called the Thanksgiving Address. And this is a beautiful praise of God and his creation. And that is said at every council meeting, at any ceremony, at any moment of celebration, at funerals. This Thanksgiving Address is spoken. And there is a sort of a version of it that you can read off, but more often than not, what you see Haudenosaunee people that lead this address is they're doing it off the cuff. And so sometimes it can take 15 minutes, sometimes it can take the whole day. So it really depends on where they want to go with it. And it's just really, really beautiful. And I linked here, I can share my slides. I linked to a version of the Thanksgiving Address that is held in the Smithsonian, so you can get an example of what that looks like. And these rituals of Thanksgiving that the Haudenosaunee have and that other Indigenous nations have follow and celebrate the seasons. So for the Haudenosaunee, there are 13 of these ceremonies each year that follow the lunar calendar, and they're very oriented around the seasons. So there's a strawberry festival in June, for example, when the strawberries are ready to be harvested, and there's a new moon, a new year ceremony in January that focuses on using ash from the fires in order to help get the husks off their, that's not the right word I'm looking for, but their corn, like the little thing outside of the corn. It's completely slipping my mind what that word is right now. So really, really tuned into the environment and the seasons as they are in cyclical, living out these rituals each year. So my favorite quote from Laudato Si is Pope Francis pointing out that we have forgotten that we ourselves are dust of the earth. Our very bodies are made up of her elements. We breathe her air and we receive life and refreshment from her waters. And I think that the point that Pope Francis is also making to us here is that we have forgotten that we belong to this earth that God has given us, that we are not just here to take from it and to live on it, that we are meant to live in harmony with the earth and really belong to the ground that is under our feet. And that can apply to the area where you're living now or to the area where you grew up, if those are different areas. We can feel very strong pulls towards land that is deeply familiar or special to us in some way. And this is something that can really go a long way towards that ecological conversion that we're thinking about. So let's think about ways that we can put this into action. I'm just realizing that I've had an extra slide in there, please ignore. So some things that are really important that I wanted to put right out in front is tribal activism. So we have talked a lot about environmental activism and how important that is. So think of doing your environmental activism and also think about ways in which that you can engage with tribal activism, because Indigenous peoples are stewards of so much of the world's biodiversity. Their issues are everyone's issues. So consider voting for local, state, and federal representatives that support Native rights, either in their claims to land or in treaties being fairly lived out, in Native access to things like water, clean water, things like that. Think of the Dakota Access Pipeline is where this image is from, and how much that kind of galvanized the nation. So there are things like that to learn and research and think about what are ways that I can get involved in that, even if it's not making a dramatic gesture of flying out somewhere or things like that. What are ways that you can get involved where you are, as well as to support Indigenous run businesses and organizations. That is really important in this marketplace. Think about ways that you can develop your own ethics of place in taking inspiration from Indigenous peoples. And particularly what I think should be the first step in that is research the Indigenous lands that you live on and find out either who is still living there or who originally lived there if they no longer live there. And I've linked an Indigenous run website where you can type in your address and it'll pull up the various nations whose land you are living on. And they will link out to their their nation's website so that you can learn more about them. And they've got a really nice education piece on that website as well. So I strongly recommend it as a first step. Start learning about the first peoples from where you live. Another way to develop your own ethics of place is to think about, what can I do to change what's growing in my yard? This is starting to be a little bit more of a topic that people are hearing these days. Instead of planting grass, if you have a new area in your yard, are there native plants and flowers that I can plant that will attract pollinators, for example? And that won't be a plant that came over from Europe that's going to perhaps take more from the soil than is able to give back, things like that. And the St. Gedaling Conservation Center has a great website where you can learn what those plants are in your area, and you can actually register your habitat with them. It's a very cute program. They'll send you a sign, and it's really nice. You can build a Mary garden, so that's great. And then my last bit of steps to share is the idea of seasonal living. So, thinking about changing your diet, purchasing food from a farmer's market or from the store according to what's in season, as opposed to just any time of year, eating watermelon in the middle of January. We all know it's not as good then anyway. And there's a great a Lakota chef. He goes by the Sioux Chef, which I think is a great pun. He's got a cookbook. He's got a website. It's all about sort of Native American cuisine, but also these ways of living sustainably and in season. That's a great pickup. And this doesn't sound like it should be connected, but I love praying the Liturgy of the Hours as a way of connecting with creation, because the Liturgy of the Hours is tied into prayer throughout the day. And so you might be praying Psalms in the morning that are about the dawn and things like that. And the evening is about, closing up at night. And they're all tied into the liturgical year. So you really get this sense of the cycle of time that is passing and being really in communion with nature. And bring back our villages. We are, everybody lives away from their families nowadays, and it can be really hard to have that village. But, if you need to, but you can make a village even if you're not around family. So if you need a new thing for your house, instead of going out and buying it new, check out a Buy Nothing group on Facebook where people are just giving away things that they don't need anymore, and you could just pick it up for free. And then you didn't have to go out and buy something new. And really get to know your neighbors, trying to find ways to foster community with the people around you, even if it's not done in this traditional manner. And that will also help us be thinking about other people when we are making these decisions about the world around us. So thanks very much. Look forward to our upcoming conversation among the panelists and with all of you.
Thank you, Shauna. I knew that by inviting you, it would enrich our conversation. I want to give up the panelists a little bit of time to comment, be in a little bit of dialogue conversation, and then I will bring in some of the questions that have come in the Q&A. So I open it up to you. Not sure who wants to get started and be the first one to say something.
I'll get started since I got to listen to everyone following me. First of all, thank you to both of you. And I loved both of your presentations. And I think, as you said, Shauna, I think each of them highlights so well key elements of what the Laudato Si message is about. You and I are more on the level of perspective, but you gave some very specific and great examples at the end. And I hope we can benefit from your slides and links. And Juliet, thank you as always. I'm working on the shorter hours of work stuff myself right now. And so I'm now fantasizing about coming to see you at Boston College and continuing to work. But I love the statistics you're bringing in about the differences that makes. So thank you.
Shauna, did you want to go, or do you want me to go? Or
Go right ahead. I'm catching my breath a little bit.
Yeah, that was a great presentation. Thank you so much. And just thinking about, to me, one of the really interesting things was your point about how Indigenous people are combining that hyper local with the activism, because activism like DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, for example, that had a national dimension to it, and yet, so that, to me, that's really, really interesting, and that sort of the idea of tend your own garden, pay attention to your own lands, but also because we are in an interconnected global ecosystem, that means all of us have to also pay attention to what other people are doing that is affecting our own lands. So, because the people, we're experiencing it now with the wildfires, the smoke in one place comes to another. So these ecological impacts just travel so much. And that is the, that makes it so clear how interconnected we all are, and how we have to have that sort of dual focus of the hyper local as well as that larger connection. So really, really important.
Well, I must say that I really liked how we went from the theological perspective to some of those practical, economic, kind of sociological perspectives, and then went to learning from a community that has a lot to teach us and has not been able to have their voice heard so much. So at this point, Shauna, do you have anything, or should we enter into the Q&A section?
Let's go ahead and enter into Q&A.
Okay, perfect. So one of the questions that kept coming up, and I'm going to rephrase it as it's there. One of the issues is you spoke, Julia, about the more unequal a society, the more carbon emissions. And can you explain that a little bit about why is that?
So there are a couple of things. One is just emissions are very tightly tied with income and spending. So people with more income tend to spend more and they have more emissions. So that was that sort of first slide that I showed about footprints. And one thing I'll just say here, and it relates to one of the questions that I saw in either the chat or the Q&A, which is, on the one hand, you could just say, you could look at the material, you could read Laudato say, you could look at the material in these presentations to say, and just say, look, we just got to tell people they need to consume less, they need to drive less and fly less and have fewer children and et cetera, and that's all that we need to do. And the fact is that people like me and others probably on this call have been doing that for decades, and it's not a powerful enough approach. And until you change the economic system, until you change the way money is flowing through the system, until you change how money creates political power, and that gets us to the second way that inequality connects with carbon emissions, which is that people, the wealthy are disproportionately the owners of the polluting companies. They disproportionately benefit from the pollution, as well as have their own absolutely gargantuan footprints. And we've been seeing a lot of emphasis these days on private planes because they're one of the most wasteful and really obscene examples of individual irresponsibility. And so it's both direct consumption emissions, but also through their political power. It's the billionaire class who has been stopping action on climate and other ecological issues, who has been trying to defund the EPA and overturn protections and so forth. So those are two key ways.
Thank you for that. And I think that even responds to some of the things that have been coming up in the chat about the personal changes that we do that are needed. We need to do them, but we need to step up to something even bigger. And as a Catholic community, we can, as a community, do those kind of things. There was a quick question about remote work. Does remote work help cut emissions at the same level as cutting hours? And then there's a secondary, and I'll put it right out there. which is, I think, a question that's really important. How do we deal in the US society with a shorter work week, work hours, when so many of our working poor are having to work more and more hours in order to be able to survive and just meet basic needs?
Yeah. So on the first, remote work definitely helps because it reduces commuting emissions, which are a big part of those transportation emissions. We think that even holding, even if people are not working remotely, we are seeing reductions in commuting emissions when people go from 5 to 4 days because they commute one fewer day. And in our research on the US and Canada companies in the the first trials that we've done, even though remote days were falling, we did see less commuting and also less commuting by car. When people have a bit more time, they can start to commute in some other ways. So that's it. They're not the same, but they're both remote work and shorter work hours both have an impact. Remind me what that second one was.
The second one was about workers that are low wage workers.
Yes, of course. So this is extremely important. The shorter work hours, I focused on two things, shorter work hours and inequality. And shorter work hours alone cannot solve the problem of low wages. They can contribute to solving it. They do tend to, if companies that go from 5 to 4 days of work without changing pay are giving people a higher hourly wage. So that's a good thing. If we reduce the work week, the statutory work week to 32 hours, which is something that is finally now coming onto the agenda in this country, that will also raise wages because it means that any worker who has to work more than 32 will get a 50% increase in there, as long as they're a waged worker. So we need, shorter work hours are not the only thing we need. We also need, in my view, we need to raise the federal minimum wage to at least 15 and more. In fact, 15 was good maybe some years ago. We need, if it had kept up with inflation, it would be somewhere in the 20s. We need a living wage in every location in this country. I think we need a universal basic income as well. But anything that reduces inequality is going to help on the low wage end. And the other thing about reduced hours is that it can often lead to more pressure to raise wages.
Thank you. The next two questions, I think, are for Shauna, and they have to do with how do you correctly say Kateri's name? They didn't catch it. That's the first one. And second is for folks that do have Mary Gardens and they're doing that sort of work, would it be appropriate to reach out to local Indigenous community and ask them to join them in that kind of work?
Yeah, great question. So as for pronunciation, so in Mohawk, K's, oh, hold on, it's my...
Talk about sustainability.
Yes, it's a sustainability initiative, my motion detector. In Mohawk, K's are pronounced as G's and T's are pronounced as D's. So that's where the pronunciation, I pronounce it Gadali because that's how the community that I was in pronounced it growing up. In the past year or two, I've actually learned that given where the accents are placed on her name in Mohawk, it should actually just put the emphasis on the first syllable instead. So Gadali. So it would be Saint Gadali.
Gadali.
But I sort of keep just trend towards what I grew up saying. But yes, if you can hit that first K as a G, you're going to be halfway there. But of course, you can anglicize it as well, but Mohawks would pronounce it Gadali or Gadali.
Thank you.
And then as for the question about like Mary Gardens and such, so I suppose it depends on the nature of the project. I am a little hesitant to recommend just going ahead and reaching out to a local Indigenous nation, if only because you want to be careful that you're reaching out to them and not just saying, hey, will you come and do some like free work for us? Like just consult with us and let us know what we should plant, and have it be more of a, okay, maybe there's some community land or things like that it would, we would really love to, to partner and to get this important perspective in here. So it would depend on the nature of the project. I would say, you might actually just want to start with reaching out to the St. Gedalia Conservation Center. The link is in my slides. You can also Google it, because they have people on staff that can tell you which plants and such are indigenous to your area. And they also have a member of staff that is really great at designing. So you can give her a space and she can say, oh, it would look great if you put, 2 rows of this plant here and a little Mary statue there. Like, she's wonderful. She's got that vision. So they may be a good starting ground just to get you started on, kind of what belongs there and give you a rough sense of design, particularly if it's more something that's on private land. But if you're thinking of public land, something that would be, something for the community, then I think then maybe it makes more sense to reach out to an Indigenous nation.
And really quickly, this question is for Christine. And it's not necessarily what you focused on, but I think you have a good answer. I'm sure you do. And that is, how are we going to move our pastors and fellow parishioners to embrace the theological perspective that you brought up? How do we encourage them to live more sustainably and change their habits and take time to be activists and change public policy? What's the magic for that?
I don't know if there's magic. I know that in my own parish in the Bronx, I doubt whether most of the parishioners know what Laudato Si even is. And so I think there's just a huge education and consciousness raising task. And yes, it starts with the pastor on some level, but it can come from us. And something as simple as saying, let's read Laudato Si in our parish. Let's start, getting together and talking about how this relates to the lights we use and, the land we're on and so forth. That is the way I think to start, because it's church teaching. But I also think my pastor is so overworked and so busy that with all the good intentions, a lot of stuff falls to the ground. So I think it's the people in a parish who have woken up, who have a real opportunity and a real obligation to start to make that difference. Because what a wasted resource, the parishes, the church. I mean, they're so potentially powerful, and yet we're dormant right now in so many, in the majority of places. So that's why I'm excited about this project, this movement. I think part of the whole goal is to wake up people at the grassroots and then get others on board. But I think it's probably got to come from the lay people to the pastors and to their fellow parishioners.
Thank you for that. And somebody just put start a creation care team, and that's another thing close to my heart. So yes, if you want to start a creation care team in your community, contact me and I'll help you with that. Thank you. Thank you so much. We're almost at the 9:30 mark, so we're going to have to wrap it up. And let me go and share my screen at this point. And of course, slideshow is not wanting to be slideshow. Okay. So at this point, I want to thank everybody who has attended today, especially our 3 panelists. I also want to remind everybody that the conference continues on July 11th with a session on ecological education at 8 p.m. Eastern. You will receive the recording of this webinar and then a reminder for the next session. We close.
What about the slides? Sorry to interrupt. What about the slides?
If you'd like to send me your final slides, I can include them in with the recordings. Yes. I always let the panelists decide if they want the slides included. Yes. So if you will join me in a closing prayer. Again, center ourselves. Thank you all for your wisdom and sharing your knowledge. Let us remember at this point that we are in the presence of God. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Let us pray. Creator God, we can choose to live differently. Inspire us as we make choices so that we will recognize the impact our lives have on our environment and our human family around the globe. We pray to the Creator, God, help to reclaim the future. Loving God, we can reclaim the future. Encourage us to be people of hope as we look forwards in faith, knowing that we can build a world of justice and peace. We pray to the Creator, God, help to reclaim the future. Brilliant God, we can choose to live in a way that creates a better world for everyone. Help us to know that our individual actions are made in solidarity with our sisters and brothers. We pray to the Creator, God, help to reclaim the future. Wonderful God, you invite us to live simply, to live sustainably, and to live in solidarity with the poor. Help us to respond to that invitation with conviction and generosity. We pray to the Creator, God, help to reclaim the future. God of justice, listen to us as we pray this day. In the silence of our heart, we place all our needs before you. We pray to the Creator, God, help to reclaim the future. God of grace and love, we bring you our prayers, our commitments, our gifts to you this day. Let us who have a keen dedication and awareness of your creation and all that it brings to the human family have courage and conviction that we are able to contribute to the sustainability of our common home. Pour out your blessing upon us today. May each of our actions reveal our awareness that we are partners with you in the creation and sustainability of this earth that you have given us to appreciate and enjoy. We ask this in the name of your Son. Amen. In the name of Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Thank you all. Hope to see you, all those attending on July 11th for ecological education. Blessings to everybody. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And
Really
everyone for putting
great.
this together.